Hello and welcome to today's webinar on bridging user needs and design requirements. Answers are only as good as the questions we ask. My name is John Spear and I'm the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory here at Greenlight Guru and the moderator for today's event. We got a really fantastic presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter Dr. Michael Drews is really looking forward to sharing with you his insights and experience around user needs and design requirements. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy with vascular sciences, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Mike has been kind enough to answer as many of your questions as time permits. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as possible at the tail end of today's session. Secondly, I want to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission that many of you have participating in today's webinar. Anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free webinar training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants like Mike Drews, or through our award-winning quality management software platform. If you'd like to learn more about why and how medical device companies all over the globe in more than 600 cities from over 35 countries are ditching their broken paper-based quality systems and outdated legacy software for a new modern quality management software platform designed exclusively from the ground up for medical device makers and manufacturers, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation and request one of our free one-on-one personalized conversations and demonstrations of the platform. In it, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging the Greenlight Guru EQMS software to gain ISO 13485 certification, breeze through audits, and push beyond just compliance to focusing on true quality. So like I said, if you're interested, just go to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and get your free personalized demo scheduled. All right, so let's get on to today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to today's presenter, a partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Mike Drews. Michael Drews, PhD, is president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation, preparation, and defense. He may be a familiar voice to many of you as he is also a frequent guest on the Global Medical Device podcast. Dr. Drews received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in biomedical engineering from Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. He's also worked for and consulted with leading medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies ranging in size from startups to Fortune 100 companies. He also works on a regular basis for U.S. Food and Drug Administration, yes, that's right, FDA, as well as Health Canada, the U.S. and European patent offices, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. So if you need any sort of creative regulatory strategy, submission design, FDA presentation, preparation, and defense or more, Mike is simply one of the best out there. So be sure to get in touch with him. So without further ado, let me hand it over to our presenter, Mike Drews.
Well, thank you so much, John, for that very kind and somewhat long-winded introduction. I want to also thank all of my friends at Greenlight.Guru for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today, and a special thank you to everybody in the audience for attending, because without you, there wouldn't be much point of doing this. Just a quick emphasis to one of the things that John mentioned about my background, and then we're going to continue on. In addition to providing consulting services to a wide variety of companies, I also work part-time as a consultant for the FDA as well as Health Canada and some of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I mention that, for those of you that don't know me already, is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I try to use that to my advantage. As John mentioned, I am fortunate to be part of the Greenlight Global Medical Device podcast series. In addition to that, I have a number of other podcasts and columns and articles. So I would encourage you to visit some of these sites as you have time. I have a lot of information out there on a wide variety of topics. If you ever have a difficult time sleeping one night, some of this might be a good treatment for insomnia. Off-label use, of course. Anyway, in terms of today's webinar, here's what I'm hoping to talk about in the short time that we have together. Talking about design inputs, what they are, and how, most importantly, how to make sure that we have the right ones. What's the relationship between design inputs and user needs? How do we translate how do we translate user needs into a viable product? And most important to me, not just a viable product, not just a product that works, but the right product. Regrettably, sometimes there's not enough emphasis on making the right product in our industry today. So how do we translate these user needs into design requirements? Can the regulations help us? How to read between the lines in terms of user feedback and try to figure out not just what the user tells you what they need, but what they really need. Those things are not always one and the same. How do we sync our design requirements and our user needs? And then finally, at the end, a little bit in terms of the challenges of the future and whatever other interesting topics we can include in examples and case studies in the time that we have together. But most importantly, and I cannot emphasize this point enough, this is the tagline of today's webinar: answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. So in other words, what good is getting the right answer if we're asking the wrong question? Unfortunately, this happens in medical device industry a lot. Coming from a medical background myself, I used to teach medical school back in the day. I would say to my med students, the surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Many of you have heard that expression before, probably. The surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Well, the regulatory equivalent of that is we followed the regulation perfectly. That is, we did all that FDA asked us to do, and yet the patient died anyway. The engineering equivalent of that is we designed our medical device perfectly, and yet the patient died anyway. Regrettably, these things happen more often than some people would like to admit, and they're all just manifestations. They're all just, to use an engineering phrase, the root cause of all of the things that I just described is the adage that's on the screen. Answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. And I'm going to share with you at least a few examples during this webinar today, and I'm hoping that during the discussion at the end we can talk about it more. By the way, there is a handout that is available or will be available after the webinar is over, so please make sure you get a copy of that. And of course, if you have any specific questions that you'd like to talk to me about, you can either submit them after the webinar is over or contact me directly. So before continuing on into the subject matter, I would like to kind of see where we are as an audience. So I have a few questions. John, if we can ping the audience on these questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, where do your user needs originate? You have three choices: within your design team, within your company, or outside your company. That's all question number one. That's
all right, Mike. So
go ahead.
I got that poll live right now, so the responses are coming in.
Great. And we'll wait for a few seconds for people to respond. And then let me just mention, while people are doing that, the second two questions: have you ever translated user needs into design inputs? That's a simple yes or no. And finally, do you measure the efficacy of your user needs in your design inputs? Once again, yes or no. So if you could please just take a few seconds and respond to those questions. I'd just like to see where we are as an audience.
All right, so let me share the results of the first one, Mike. So 38% said they share or they originate within the design team, 43% within the company, and 76% outside of the company.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
All right, so let me go ahead and launch the next item. So this is, again, have you translated your user needs into design inputs, yes or no? So this one should be fairly quick to respond to. All right, so we'll share the results. So 90% say yes, 10% no.
Okay, great. Thank
And
you.
then the last question, do you measure the efficacy of your user needs / design inputs, yes or no?
That's my favorite question of this list, John, because as you know, that is not a regulatory requirement and it's not the conventional use of the word efficacy, but as we'll talk about later, I'm purposely using that word here to see what people think. So what are the results of that one so far, John?
Yeah, this one is a really good question because it's right around split actually. 53% say yes, 47% no.
Well, that's good. I probably would have guessed it might have even been lower than that, but 50-50 is not bad. Okay, thank you everybody for sharing that. That does help me sort of gauge the level of information. Just a quick disclaimer before we progress with the content. I can't possibly make you an expert in this topic in just a few minutes. I'm not even going to try, but I do want to share with you, and for those of you that know me, you've probably heard me say this before, my philosophy of education, and that is to teach you how to think, not what to think. To teach you how to think, not what to think. One of my frustrations with a lot of folks in regulatory and quality today is they seem to be more focused on just simply following the rules like a recipe, like a computer executing lines of code one after another without stopping and asking, gee, does this even make sense? So my emphasis here is to teach you how to think, not what to think. And speaking of thinking, another question that sometimes people ask me is it possible to think regulatory? Well, the late, great Carl Sagan said that science is a way of thinking more than it is a body of knowledge. My sort of regulatory spin on Dr. Sagan's quote is regulatory affairs is a way of thinking much more than a body of rules and regulations, or at least it should be. Remember, as I said a moment ago, we followed the regulation perfectly, but the patient died anyway. That is not obviously something that our goal should be. So this is a very unusual, a very uncommon approach, but it is my approach. And I really believe that if we did take this approach, our products would be better, our industry would be better, the world would be a better place, and maybe Carl Sagan would even be proud. Okay, with that, let's start digging into the actual content of the webinar. Remember, we're talking here about user needs and design inputs, and how do we translate between the two. So let's start out with a design input. What's a design input? Well, one thing that a good regulatory professional might do is consult the regulation. So let's take a look and see what the regulation says a design input is. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures to ensure that design requirements relating to a device are appropriate. I'm going to talk about a few of these words in just a moment. Are appropriate and address the intended use of the device, including the needs of the user and patient. The procedure shall include a mechanism for addressing incomplete, ambiguous, or conflicting requirements. And finally, the design input requirements shall be documented and shall be reviewed and approved by designated individuals. The approval, including the date and signature, shall be documented, yada, yada, yada. Okay, let me dig into what I think are the most important parts of this regulation. So first of all, the requirements relating to a device are appropriate. Well, appropriate is obviously a very touchy-feely word. It can be interpreted many different ways. But as we'll talk about in a moment, that interpretation is up to us. one thing that a lot of people don't seem to realize nowadays is that regulation is written in most cases to cover a broad audience, a broad range of companies, a broad range of devices and technologies. And at the end of the day, it's up to us to interpret this regulation and to apply it to our particular situation. It needs to address the intended use of the device. In a moment, I'm going to dig into intended use a little bit more because it's a commonly used phrase, but it's also a very misunderstood phrase, both in industry as well as at FDA. There are many people who think they know what intended use is, but they really do not. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But one of the reasons why I flag it here is because the regulation is specifically defining design inputs in terms of intended use. Well, what about other uses for our particular device that might not be our intended use, that might not be on our label? This brings up to the whole context of off-label use. Unfortunately, nowadays, many people seem to be more concerned about how our medical devices are used in the theoretical world of regulatory affairs, where people assume that we read and follow labels. But I don't know where those people live. I live in the real world, and most medical devices are not limited to just simply on-label use. And not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but for those of you that have listened to some of John and my podcasts in the past, you know that a lot of my work now involves working as an expert witness in medical device product liability cases. And long story short, if a patient is injured because of one of your medical devices, even if it's being used off-label, you as a manufacturer can and often are held liable for problems that occur even when your product is being used off-label if the opposing counsel can show that it's what we call an anticipated off-label use. So bottom line, I don't want to get into too much of a discussion of product liability here, but just because you include something on your label and don't include something else on your label does not necessarily mean that your device will only be used that way, and it certainly doesn't mean that if your device is used the other way that you couldn't be held liable. Again, if anybody has any specific questions on that, you're welcome to talk to me about it. It needs to meet the needs of the user and the patient. Well, historically, most of the time, medical device users have been some sort of a physician or surgeon or nurse or pharmacist, some sort of a trained medical professional. But nowadays, as many of you probably know, the user and the patient is one and the same. In other words, we have more and more medical devices that are being designed to be used outside of a hospital, outside of a clinic, oftentimes in people's homes. And so the user and the patient is now sometimes one and the same. And this presents other kinds of challenges. For those of you that are familiar, for example, with human factor or usability testing, as I've talked about in other discussions, usability testing for devices that are going to be used by an untrained professional is even more important than usability testing for trained professionals. And this is something that I have mentioned to FDA many, many times, because regrettably in all of the guidances that FDA has put out in the area of human factors, none of them even go near that particular point. And I think that's solely lacking. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to point out in terms of this definition is we need to obviously have a procedure to include a mechanism to address incomplete, ambiguous, or conflicting requirements. Well, once again, I'll show you some examples of this in a moment, but the underlying assumption there is that we recognize that there's an incomplete, ambiguous, or conflicting requirement. In many of the situations that I get involved with, when a problem is discovered, one of the reasons why is because nobody saw this before. And on one hand, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but on the other hand, there's a lot more that we can do to identify potential problems before they occur and to try to prevent them, as opposed to trying to deal with that afterwards. So bottom line, what does any of this regulation really mean? Well, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. That is obviously what the regulation says. But remember, regulation is all about the interpretation of words and your ability to defend your interpretation. This same set of words can be interpreted in many, many different ways. Our particular interpretation really doesn't matter. What matters most is our ability to defend it. And by the way, why would anybody assume that FDA's interpretation of these words is any better or any more accurate than anybody else's, including mine? I interpret words in many different ways depending on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So one of my most important jobs when I go to the FDA, and I'm down there very frequently, usually once a month, if not more, and I'm on the phone, probably every week, if not more, is to convince FDA that my interpretation of the words is the appropriate one in that particular circumstance. So I just want to go off on a small tangent here and talk a tiny bit about labeling. I know that this is not the intent of this particular webinar, but because intended use is part of the definition that I just shared with you, I really want to make sure that everybody understands this because, as I said a moment ago, there's a lot of misunderstanding in industry as well as in FDA is what intended use is and how it differs from indications for use. These are both very commonly used phrases, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. As an FYI, for those that are particularly interested in this topic, I have done other podcasts on specifically this topic. As a matter of fact, one of the webinars that I did on this is actually now part of FDA's internal website for their reviewer training because there is just so much confusion. I have seen in approved submissions, in 510Ks and PMAs, even in the drug and biologic world, in the NDAs and the BLAs, I have seen where the indication for use and the intended use statements are flat out wrong, 100% wrong in the submissions that have been approved. And when I point this out to the FDA, they say, yes, thank you for telling us you're right, but the submission has already gone through, so there's nothing that we can do to change it. Unfortunately, that's our government hard at work. What can we say? But nonetheless, this is another thing that I say to people. Just because FDA says something doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. Everybody can make mistakes. There's the I'm a big fan of the old Ronald Reagan mantra, trust but verify. So let's talk a little bit about intended use. Oftentimes these two phrases are used synonymously, and there is some overlap, but there are some important differences. They're both examples of what I call high-level labeling, as opposed to low-level labeling, which would be the directions for use, the DFU, that type of thing. So the indications for use focuses on the patient. In other words, what disease, injury, condition does the product diagnose, treat, and so on and so on. Doesn't matter if it's a medical device, drug, biologic, combination product, doesn't make any difference. Indications for use focuses on the patient. And please be careful about using the phrase or the acronym IFU for indications for use, because that's often confused with instructions for use. And instructions for use, which is the same as directions for use, is absolutely not the same as indications for use. So this is just my personal preference, I prefer not to use the acronym IFU because it just confuses people. Instead, I use the acronym DFU for directions for use, not to be confused with indications for use. And this is an example of what I call low-level labeling, directions for use. And let's be honest, when a physician takes a medical device out of a package and pulls the directions for use out along with it, what's the first thing they typically do? They throw it right in the trash. Similarly, for package inserts in the drug world, in the drug world, as I often like to say, who, after reading the contents of a package insert, would ever swallow what was in the package? The package inserts are clearly not written for patients. If they're not written for patients, why do we put them in the package? The simple answer is because we have to, because we're required to. But in my opinion, that's not a good reason to do anything. The thing that I wanted to focus on here is intended use, because that's what's mentioned in the definition that I just shared with you a moment ago. So what's intended use? Intended use, the focus is on the product. So what does the product, in our particular case, what does the medical device actually do? How does it work? What's its mechanism of action? And so on and so on. So that's what we're talking about here, the intended use. Now, again, I have lots of recommendations when it comes to labeling. I've included them in this slide for just completeness, but since this is not a labeling discussion, I'm going to go ahead and continue on. If anybody does have questions in more detail on labeling, I'm happy to discuss those with you. So the next question to ask is, what's the relationship between design inputs and user needs? Typically, we collect our user needs first, and then we translate those to design inputs. And I found it interesting in the polling question that I shared at the beginning of the webinar. If I remember the statistics right, I think about a third of the audience said that those user needs were generated internally within the design group. With all due respect, that's wrong, because unless you are using your device yourself, if you're not the intended user, then how can you come up with a user need? You can come up with what you think should be the user needs, but you should verify those with your actual users. This is another example of how it's more important not to understand the wording of the regulation, but the intent of the regulation. So the intent of the regulation, and we'll talk about the limitations of this in a moment, but the intent of the regulation is to make sure that we start out with addressing the needs of the actual user, and then we translate those into engineering terms, what we call design inputs. So in the regulation, I just shared with you the definition of a design input. Interestingly enough, there is no definition for a user need. Should there be? Well, perhaps some people might think so, but I would say not. Here's the closest thing in the regulation that we have. This is part of design validation. So design validation shall ensure that devices conform to defined user needs and intended uses. We've talked about intended use, but not user needs very much yet. And design validation means establishing by objective evidence, whatever that means, objective evidence, that the device specifications conform with the user needs and the intended uses. Once again, no editorializing. That's exactly what the regulation says. But it's our job to interpret that regulation and then to be able to defend our interpretation. Notice there's nothing in here about assessing whether the user need is correct or not. One of the underlying assumptions here, as we'll talk more about in some of the examples later, one of the underlying assumptions of all of the design controls, including this particular section, is that the user really knows what they need. And in my experience, I've been now in this business for a little over 25 years, and I started out a long time ago as an R&D engineer. I learned not to assume that the user knows what they really need. They probably think they know what they need, but they don't necessarily know what they really need. And again, I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. So should the phrase user need be defined by the regulation? Well, again, I'll leave that to a certain extent to a rhetorical question, but keep in mind it's the spirit of the regulation here that's most important. That needs to be interpreted by you. So who is your user? Is it a physician? Is it a surgeon? Is it a nurse? Is it a pharmacist? Is it a regular person, an untrained medical professional? And you need to define those terms and procedures as appropriate in your individual quality management system or QMS. And let me use this as an opportunity to dig into one of my favorite sections of the FDA website. It's the preamble to the QMS, and I think regrettably not many people seem to have read this or have remembered it. But good regulation, in my opinion, is neither specific nor is it rigid, and quite frankly, it shouldn't be. And this is exactly what FDA says in the preamble to the quality system regulation. And again, I'm only going to just share with you a portion of it. You can read it on FDA's website. Medical device regulation must apply to many different types of devices. So the regulation does not prescribe in detail how a manufacturer must produce a specific device. Rather, the regulation provides the framework, an outline, if you will, that all device manufacturers, I would say, should follow, not must follow, requiring manufacturers to develop and follow procedures and fill in the details that are appropriate to their particular device, to their particular technology. Further, manufacturers should use good judgment, and that's one of the most important phrases here. Use good judgment when developing their quality system and apply those sections of the quality system regulation that are applicable to their particular products and operations, to their devices, to their technologies, and so on and so on. It's the responsible of each individual manufacturer to establish what these requirements are for themselves, for a type of family of devices or an individual device that will result in devices that are safe and effective. You know, one of the things that I see sometimes happen is people develop sort of generic quality systems that can be applied to many different companies, many different technologies, and at least in my opinion, that defeats the whole purpose of having a quality management system. Quality management system, and indeed all regulation, is intended to be personalized, is intended to be adopted, modified to that particular device, that particular technology, that particular organization, and so on and so on. It's the responsibility for meeting these requirements and for having objective evidence for meeting these requirements that may not be delegated, even though you might be delegating some of the actual work. So bottom line, we all know in the medical device industry, lots of folks farm things out. There's nothing wrong with that. But as I like to describe it, at the end of the day, the company whose name is at the top of the label is the one that's ultimately responsible. That's exactly what FDA is reminding everybody here. And finally, the essential elements that a quality system shall embody without prescribing specific ways to establish them are what's being described in the subsequent sections. Because the quality system regulation covers a broad spectrum of devices and production procedures and so on, it allows some leeway. I would argue it allows an awful lot of leeway, as it should, in terms of the details of the quality system elements. It is left to the manufacturer to determine the necessity for or the extent of some quality elements and to develop and implement specific procedures tailored to their particular processes and their particular devices. So bottom line, in many, many words, FDA is saying exactly what I said a moment ago. Regulation is all about the interpretation of words and our ability to defend our interpretation. Both FDA as well as myself are saying exactly the same thing. We're just using slightly different words, and in my particular case, I'm using a heck of a lot fewer words than FDA is, although that usually doesn't happen. Usually, for those of you that know me, I probably use more words than I sometimes need to. Anyway, the important thing to remember is that the logic that we're talking about here should be applied to all regulation across the board, no exceptions. All regulation should be considered as suggestion, as guidance, if you will, not to be followed rigidly, like, as I said earlier, a computer executing lines of code. And speaking of rules and exceptions, average regulatory professionals know the rules. Better regulatory professionals know the exceptions, but the best regulatory professionals know the exceptions to the exceptions. And James Thurber said that there's no exception to the rule, that every rule has an exception. So I hope everybody appreciates my not so subtle use of humor here. And finally, just one last little bit of philosophy, and then we'll come back to the subject matter, and that is, don't just follow the rules, think. Douglas MacArthur said that rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not saying that rules are not important. I'm not saying that we should not follow the rules or that we should break the rules, and I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. But what I am saying is this: if the rules make sense, then we should follow them. But if the rules don't make sense, and every single week, sometimes every day in my professional career as a regulatory consultant, I run into regulation and rules that simply do not make sense. If the regulation doesn't make sense, then we shouldn't follow it. We should figure out another way to accomplish the same thing. But at the same time, we should go and take it to the FDA and say, look, here's what the regulation says, and it doesn't make sense, or in our particular case, it's not applicable, and here's why, and here's what we're planning on doing instead. That's all. That's the way this game is supposed to be played, at least for me. Okay, back to some concrete examples. So let's take a look at a very simple example. So let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that one of our users is a doctor, is a physician or a surgeon or something like that, and the doctor tells us that the device needs to be portable. That's a user need, or is it? Well, I would argue, in fact, and this is not specified in the regulation at all, that this is merely a convenience or a request. This is really not a user need, but I don't want to get into too much semantics here. Most people, including FDA, would define this as a user need. The device needs to be portable. The question is, to the engineer, when you're designing that device, what exactly does that mean? So, for example, does the device need to be lightweight? If it needs to be lightweight, what does lightweight mean? Does it mean less than 5 pounds? Does it mean less than a pound? Does it mean less than 10 pounds? Or perhaps weight is less of a concern if we can put it on a cart. That way we don't have to pick it up and carry it around. We can just simply push it around. Well, if it's on a cart, how big is the cart? In other words, is this something that needs to go through hospital halls and doorways, which are relatively large? On the other hand, if this is something that needs to be pushed around in somebody's home, the doors and hallways in an individual's home are probably smaller than they are in a hospital. So what exactly does, is the size mean? Some people would describe it as it needs to be smaller than a lunchbox. Okay, how small is a lunchbox? Some people might say it needs to be self-contained. Well, does it need to connect to the outside world? For example, does it need to be does it need electrical power? If so, do you need to be able to plug it into the wall, or perhaps it can run on a battery? Does it need to connect to the internet via Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or something like that? So I hope everybody understands the point here is the user needs. I'm sorry, not the user needs. The design inputs need to be specified in pretty significant detail. User needs can be sort of nebulous, can be sort of fuzzy, but the design inputs need to be much more specific. All of these are design inputs, but, and this is the most important thing, and regrettably, I don't think the regulation goes far enough to remind people to do this. We need to confirm our user needs with other users. In other words, don't simply rely on 1 or 2 or 3 people to tell you what your needs should be, what your device needs to be able to do. I'm a big fan, as I mentioned a moment ago, of the Ronald Reagan mantra, trust but verify. So make sure that you sample a wide enough range of your customer base, of your audience. I don't want to get into statistics and talk about, how many people you should talk to, but simply put, the more people that you talk to get their input, the better. And I don't want to talk to people who I already know in advance agree with me. I also want to include people who don't agree with me. I would go so far, and I've suggested this to companies, to talk to people who think that there is actually not a need for our particular device, and get their input as well. That's a very contrarian approach, but there's the adage, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. If I can take somebody who thinks there's not a need for my particular device and convince them that there is, then I think everybody knows where I'm going with this. And again, relating this back to quality in your QMS, All of these things need to be defined in your QMS. Regrettably, it's something that, at least in my experience, and when we get to the discussion later, perhaps John and I can talk about this a little bit, but most companies do not do. Why? Well, probably because it's not required, but nonetheless, I think it's the right thing to do. So why do we have these requirements? For one main reason, and that is that most of the time in the medical device world, the designer, the engineer, is not the user of the device. You know, one of the things that I noticed a long time ago as an R&D engineer myself in this industry, 25 plus years ago, perhaps before some of you were even born, is we had a lot of people designing devices, for example, that would go inside somebody's body, inside somebody's heart, for example, that have never held a beating heart in their hand. To me, as an engineer, and particularly a biomedical engineer, I think that's tremendously problematic. You know, it's kind of like asking somebody to design a car who's never driven a car before. And that conjures up a whole bunch of challenges. So the reason why we have this kind of regulation is because it recognizes that most of us are not physicians, are not surgeons, are not the ones that are actually using our devices in real world settings. Yes, we can use them in benchtop simulations. Yes, in some cases we can use them maybe in animals, and those are all great things to do. But most of the time, unless you have an MD after your name, you're not able to use it in a patient as it's designed to be used. So looking beyond just that particular example of a design input, let's look at some other categories of design inputs. And this is just a laundry list that I put together. It's certainly not a comprehensive list. Things that influence the function of the device, the physical characteristics, the size and the shape, and so on and so on, the performance, how does it work, safety, reliability, any kind of standards that you might be required to follow, whether it's ISO or ASTM or Underwriters Labs or those kinds of things. Obviously, regulatory requirements, human factor or ergonomic requirements, labeling and packaging, maintenance, sterilization, compatibility. And compatibility is another one of these that can be interpreted many different ways. One is in a material sense, in a biocompatibility sense, and as some of you may know, I happen to be a subject matter expert for the FDA in a few different areas, one of them being biomaterials and biocompatibility. So this is an area that I spend a fair amount of time working. But also we have device compatibility. What other devices would our particular device be, potentially interact with? For example, I've worked with a number of devices. I have one right now, a device that's being used in an MR. So obviously, we need to make sure that the device, isn't made out of ferromagnetic material, so that when we crank up the magnet, it goes flying through the room. Believe me, that has actually happened before. It's also, we need to make sure that if our device includes any kind of electronics, that we design it in such a way that it's not going to be susceptible to magnets, because I hope everybody that's taken basic physics remembers that there's a relationship between electricity and magnetism. It's not important that you understand the details of that relationship, but at least remember that there is a relationship between the two. So those are the things that we have to take into account. There might be environmental factors, and there certainly are other types of design inputs that we need to take into account as well. So here's what my recommendation is. It's 3 steps. Pardon me. The first step is to try to identify as many of these different categories or buckets of design inputs as possible. Some of these might be applicable to some of your devices, others might not be. I've just tried to create as broad of a list, a laundry list as possible. You can use this as a starting point, not as a stopping point. There might be some things on this list that are applicable to your particular device. There might be some things on this list that are not applicable, and there might be some things that are applicable to your device that are not on this list. So use this as a starting point only, not as a stopping point. Once you have identified these different types of design inputs, and by the way, you can put specific design inputs in each of these buckets. But the first thing that I suggest doing is identifying the buckets, just so that you don't miss anything. The next step would be to not simply evaluate, but reevaluate these design inputs from time to time throughout your entire design and development process. This is not something kind of like, risk management, something that many of you are used to thinking about as well. Risk management is a risk management plan, for example, is not designed to be a static document. It's not designed to be created and then stuck in a file and never touched again. If you take that approach, yes, you have met the regulatory requirement in terms of the letter of the law, but you have absolutely not met the regulatory requirement in terms of the spirit of the law. The risk management plan is designed for you to revisit it from time to time, whether it's once a year, twice a year, once a quarter, once a month. That's up to you. It depends on your technology. It depends on how well established it is. It depends on how much history there is, and so on and so on. But you need to revisit it from time to time. Similarly, I would apply the exact same regulatory logic here. We need to reevaluate our design inputs throughout the design process. Once again, I don't want to micromanage anybody. It's up to you how frequently to do that, but you need to do it at least on a periodic basis. And then finally, when you do get to the end of the process, you need to obviously test everything. This is a riff on, as I've said a couple of times now, the trust but verify. So you're taking your user needs, you're translating those into design inputs. Eventually, they will become design outputs that you measure, and then as part of the design controls, as part of the overall quality system, you need to make sure that that there's a relationship between all of those things. That's the philosophy of verification and validation testing, of V&V testing, right? So this is all stuff that I consider to be prudent engineering. This is stuff that we used to teach in engineering school back in the day. I'm not sure that we still teach it anymore, because now we seem to have so much regulation instead. And, so I'll leave this as a rhetorical question, but do we really need this regulation to tell us these things? Because to me, as a PhD in engineering, this is all common sense. But unfortunately, common sense is not as common as some of us would like to think. All of these things are important that we've been talking about here, but the last thing that I want to talk about as we approach the end of this webinar and then get into some questions and some discussions, we have not yet talked about what I think is the most important and the least emphasized in all of the regulation. Really, I would argue it's not even mentioned at all, and that is, what's the clinical problem that we're trying to solve? What's the root cause? Going back to the example that I shared with you a few minutes ago in terms of the device needs to be portable. Well, this is what I said a moment ago, and I stand by this. This is sort of a convenience. This is sort of a request, but that's probably, unless you're in some unusual circumstances, that really has nothing to do with the clinical problem, nothing to do with the root cause of the problem, the biology or the engineering that we're trying to solve. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is going to really present some challenges to us in the future. One of the most significant limitations of the design controls, and I hinted at this a moment ago, is the fundamental tenet, one of the basic philosophies, and that is we want to ensure that we meet the needs of our users. But as I mentioned earlier, why would any of us assume that our user knows in fact what they really need? They might think they know what they need, but they may not know what they really need. I don't like to assume that the user knows what they really need. As a matter of fact, I would prefer to assume that they do not know what they really need, and then convince them otherwise. And the reason why this is problematic is because it helps to explain why we have so much evolutionary product development and so little revolutionary product development. For those that are not familiar with those terms, let me briefly explain. So in the medical device world, most product development is very evolutionary. In other words, we have a medical device, a catheter, a stent, a hip implant, whatever it is. We make it a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, and we turn it into a new medical device. That's typically what happens most of the time in the medical device universe. It's very evolutionary, it's very incremental. And there's nothing wrong with that. I understand all of the advantages, the business advantages, the engineering advantage, even the psychological advantages. But here's the problem with that. The horse did not evolve into the car. The candle did not evolve into the light bulb. In other words, you can tweak a horse as many times as you want. You'll never end up with a car. And so if we were, good medical device professionals back in the day before we had cars and everybody was riding horses, and we went out to our users and we tried to assess their user need, and we asked them the question, what would you like to see in a better form of transportation? And again, keep in mind, everybody is riding horses. There is no car yet. Most people would probably tell us what we need is a bigger horse, a stronger horse, a faster horse, but they're all going to tell us we need some form of a new horse. Not many people are going to tell us, well, gee, a horse is okay, but what we really need is a car. And this is one of the fundamental limitations of much of the regulation, including the design controls and including this particular part of the design controls when we talk about assessing our user needs, because it goes back to that underlying assumption, and that is we're assuming that our user really knows what they need. Okay, so let's take a look at a medical device example. How about a bare metal coronary stent? Never mind a fancy schmancy drug-eluting stent. How about a simple bare metal coronary stent? As most of you know, a stent is a bare metal coronary stent is a little metallic tube that's stuck into a coronary artery that has atherosclerosis in an attempt to increase the luminal size, the diameter of that artery to increase blood flow, and so on and so on. So let's do a little reverse engineering. What would be the user need? Well, most cardiologists, if we were to ask them this question, and notice I'm saying most, I'm not saying all, because I look at the minority, not the majority, but most cardiologists would say, we need a stent to make the artery bigger because of the atherosclerosis, because of the atheroma. The lumen of the artery is small. Therefore, there's not a lot of blood getting through, and the myocardium downstream is becoming hypoxic and ischemic and ultimately necrotic or possibly even dead, right? So that would be the user need. The engineer then would take that user need and translate it to a design input that would basically, look something like the picture on the screen. We have some sort of a tube-like structure that will push the artery open, make a bigger cross-sectional area, increase the diameter, and increase blood flow, yada, 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 okay? All of that is the theory. So that's, we're reverse engineering the regulatory strategy here because obviously we have the benefit of hindsight being 2020. But does this limit us? Does this influence us? Or does this even bias us in terms of our design? I would argue absolutely yes. By talking to those particular cardiologists, now you have limited your section of your possible solutions that are only going to look like tube opening solutions. Remember, answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. So put another way, what's the biological problem? What's the root cause? Many of you probably are familiar with the adage, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, all of your problems tend to look like what? They tend to look like nails. So if you ask your user, in this particular case, a cardiologist, what's the best way to put a nail into a board, for example, all of the solutions that they're likely to give you are going to look like hammers. But the question is, what other solutions you've predisposed yourself to looking only at nails and hammers? What have you not looked at? Well, how does that apply here? We have to look at not just the devices that we have, but the devices that we don't. If we were to reframe our question and ask not how do we make the clogged artery bigger, but instead, how do we deliver more oxygen and glucose to the myocardial tissue downstream that's being affected? Now we open ourselves up to a whole bunch of other solutions, not the least of which is this one, something called transmyocardial revascularization. It's what I call mechanical angiogenesis. It doesn't involve opening up a clogged artery. Instead, in this particular case, we're using a medical device. It could be either laparoscopic or it could be a catheter-based device to use a laser to actually drill new holes into the myocardium, essentially creating new coronary arteries. This is why I call it mechanical angiogenesis. For those of you that are familiar with angiogenesis, that means growing new blood vessels. While usually most people refer to that in a biological sense, this is mechanically doing the same thing. We're creating new blood vessels by literally blasting holes in the wall of the myocardium. The point that I'm trying to make in the context of our discussion is very, very simple. User needs are predicated on the question that you ask to your user. Answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. If we ask a cardiologist, what would they like to see in a way to open up a clogged artery? That's going to give us only a limited view of the universe. On the other hand, if we ask a cardiologist, what are ways that, or ask ourselves even, what are ways that we can get more oxygen and glucose to the myocardium and not worry about the clogged cardiac artery, coronary artery? That's a whole different set of solutions. And as I said, this, true angiogenesis is growing new blood vessels. So as I often like to ask my cardiology medical device company audiences, the stent and the catheter companies, is when we're able to grow new arteries in vivo, and believe me, we're starting to do this right now. This is not something very far off. When we're able to grow new arteries in a patient, how many stents and how many catheters are we going to be using? It begs the interesting question: who's your competition? Many people would argue that their competition is what the other medical device companies are doing that are like them. So, for example, if you're a stent company, your competition is what the other stent companies are doing. Well, in my opinion, that's a pretty myopic definition of the word competition, because your competition is the entire universe. And if somebody comes along with what Clayton Christensen would say from Harvard as a disruptive technology, I think most of you in this audience understand where I'm going with this. So why is this important? Because many companies have had to change their business model, or in some cases have gone out of business because they haven't thought about these things. And I would argue that much, if not most of this, goes back to the root cause, and that is the user needs, and assessing what the user needs are early on. And there's another problem, and this is the last example I'm going to share, and then we're going to move on to the questions. Speaking of stents, so we're using stents as another example. Does the stent actually solve the problem? Well, if you talk about, it depends on what problem. If you talk about restoring blood flow, then by definition, all stents solve that problem. However, if you redefine your problem as preventing heart attacks, for example, now the stent world becomes much less black and white. And there's a growing amount of evidence, even though we've been using bare metal coronary stents for decades, there's a growing amount of evidence to suggest that maybe these very commonly used devices aren't as good as some people think. This is just one of many examples. A study from just a few months ago, we took a look, here's some background first. So about 500,000 patients per year worldwide receive stents in order to relieve chest pain at a cost between roughly $10,000 and $40,000 per patient. Well, in this particular study, they took a look at a couple of hundred patients, and they treated them for 6 weeks over drugs, and they compared those patients to patients that underwent a procedure. Either they got a real stent or a fake, what we call a sham procedure. It's one of the few studies in cardiology in which a sham procedure was given to controls who were then compared to patients receiving the actual treatment. Anyway, here's the important part. In both groups, doctors threaded catheters through the groin or the wrist with X-ray guidance up to the blocked artery. Once the catheter reached the blockage, the doctor inserted a stent, or in some cases, if they got the sham, they just simply pulled the catheter out, and here's the result. A procedure used to relieve chest pain in hundreds of thousands of people per year is totally useless in many of them. Totally useless. So what's the real sham? Is the sham doing a procedure where we don't put in a stent, or is perhaps the real sham putting in the stent itself? Now, again, this conjures up all kinds of interesting discussion points, which I'm happy to talk about. But I just want to remind everybody that the reason why I'm bringing this example up is because this goes right back to user needs and translating user needs into design inputs, not just identifying the user needs and translating them to design inputs, but identifying the proper ones. Answers are only as good as the questions that we ask. And this is from a broader area, and it's an example of what we used to refer to as evidence-based medicine. I still like that phrase. Some people now refer to it as comparative effectiveness research. Different words, but we mean the same thing. This is a cover story article from Business Week. It's a decade old, yes, but it's still one of my favorite articles, and there's a litany of articles along these lines. From heart surgery to prostate care, the medical industry knows little about which treatments really work. Treatments are based largely on rules and traditions, not on scientific evidence. Remember, one of the regulatory requirements that I shared with you at the beginning of this webinar is we're supposed to have objective evidence. Well, that's easy to say in the regulation. But when you look at the reality, and I'm only using cardiology as an example, I can give you a similar example from any area of medicine that you want to choose, any ology, it doesn't matter. When you look at the actual, to use the phrase, real world evidence, it's not always as clear cut as that. I'm going to skip this. So the last thing that I want to share with you, one last example, and then we'll open this up to some Q&A, is speaking of stents, to illustrate some of the challenges for the future. Can we print, that is 3D print a stent? I do a lot of work in 3D printing of a variety of medical devices as well as drugs and combination products. Well, what kind of a stent? Never mind a bare metal stent, that's boring, or a stent graft, that's boring, or even a drug-eluting stent, that's very boring. We've been doing that for a long time. How about being able to print a customized bioabsorbable stent? And when I say customized, I'm talking about not just customized in terms of shape and size, but customized in terms of loading this stent with a specific combination of drugs optimized for that particular patient. Think this is Star Trek-y? Absolutely not. This is not on the market yet, but we're starting to do exactly this. Here's just a little video for those of you that are not familiar with 3D printing technology. Here is an example of us 3D printing a stent. In this particular case, it's a polymeric stent. And imagine not doing this in a medical device manufacturing facility. Imagine doing this right in a hospital, right in an OR or in a cardiac catheterization lab, and then literally taking the stent from the 3D printer and putting it right into the patient. Think that's Star Trek-y? Well, we're not quite doing that right now, but we're getting awfully close. And this is a whole area of personalized medicine, and in this particular case, personalized medical devices. So I'm just simply sharing this with you as a quick example, just to show you that this is not nearly as far off as some people think. And for technologies like this, how do concepts like quality and how do concepts like user needs and design inputs even translate into technologies like you see here? Just the tip of the iceberg, something to think about. The Arthur Clarke said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So if some of this technology seems a little bit magical or far off or Star Trek-y to you, that's exactly the way I want you to think. Nothing is impossible. The impossible just takes a little longer. So let me just wrap this up by going to my last slide. I'm just going to skip to this one because I want to allow some time for Q&A. If we're going to take some inspiration, let's take inspiration from one of the best, Steve Jobs, who changed our world in some very profound ways, not just evolutionary ways, but revolutionary ways. Let me share with you one of his very first commercials for Apple Computer, where he talked about the crazy ones, the rebels. Watch this, and then we'll have some questions. So if you have not done so already, please type some questions into the Q&A chat box so we can talk about them. Here's the commercial.
here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs into square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Call me crazy, call me naive, and certainly many people do, but I'm trying to change the world. I'm trying to make the world a better place, one person at a time. It's taken me a long time, but I haven't given up. And if anybody wants to help me, I can certainly use the help. And I'm by no means going to be so arrogant as to put myself in Steve Jobs' category. However, when I gave a presentation about 2 years ago at the MD&M in Anaheim on competitive regulatory strategy to an audience of about 300 people, one of the editors of that particular publication was in the audience, and she characterized me as a regulatory rebel. So in that sense, perhaps Steve Jobs might be proud. The last quote I want to just share with you is from Albert Einstein, very, very smart guy, who said, "The world as we have created is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." And I would argue the same can be said about regulation. Our regulation should not be followed in a literal sense, in isolation. We need to be able to interpret it. We need to be able to defend our interpretation, and most importantly, we need to evolve it. As I just shared with you at the end, how do we apply concepts like user needs and design inputs to these more advanced technologies? Clearly, the technologies that I'm talking about here, clearly the regulation that we're talking about here was not intended for these new kinds of technologies, but we need to be able to adopt these old regulatory mindsets to these new technologies, not the other way around. And so anyway, that's just a quick overview of user needs and design controls. User needs and design inputs. I want to thank my friends at Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. I want to thank everybody in the audience for listening. I'm happy to stick around. We've got now some time for some Q&A. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it. And if you have a question, if you're not able to stick around, or if you're not comfortable talking about your question in sort of a public fashion, feel free to contact me directly. You've got my phone, my email, and so on. I'm happy to help wherever I can. So thank you very much, everybody. I look forward to having a good discussion. John, you take it from here.
Mike, it always impresses me how you're able to cram so much valuable information in such a finite period of time. So again, thank you so much. No, it really is. I mean, and Mike, you and I have known each other now for several years, and there are always several nuggets that I glean from these sessions with you. So thank you for being so gracious of your time to do this. But we do have a few questions.
Thank you, John. It's very kind for you to say that. And by the way, when you say cram, that's a polite way of saying that I talk too fast.
No, I mean, sure, if you want to hear that, but I mean, this is, folks, this is information. I mean, back to if you were on at the beginning, Greenlight Guru, we put these sessions on for free, and Mike is donating his time to do this and put together this information. And this is something that I think we shouldn't take for granted. This valuable information is being provided to the medical device industry by us to help become a rebel, if you will, right? And to help kind of move the needle in a positive direction to really help humanity. I know that's a lot of altruism, and that's built into that last statement, but that's really why we're doing this.
I think it's a wonderful goal, John. I was going to say the same thing. Altruism is not completely dead. It's certainly not common anymore, but it's not completely dead. So thank you for the opportunity to do this. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. So first question comes from Britta. And Britta asked, do all design inputs need to have, or are they required to have a user need?
Do all design inputs, are they required to have a user need?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I guess my counter question, and John, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. If the design input did not originate from a user need, where did it come from? In other words, somewhere, somebody, someplace, sometime must have identified a particular need, a particular feature, a particular want or desire that would then end up in a, translated to a design input. So perhaps I'm misunderstanding the question, but my first question would be, if it didn't come from a user need, where did it come from? And maybe I didn't say this in the webinar, John, but user needs, in my opinion, do not have to come just from the user. In other words, from a physician or even a patient. They can come from marketing folks. They can come from engineers. Engineers might be, might think they identify a feature that a physician never told them about. So that could be something construed as a design input. But in that particular scenario, I do think that the engineer should probably go back to the users and say, hey, I thought of perhaps adding this particular feature. Would this be a value to you as a clinician? Would this allow you to do something better or faster, or would it allow you to do something that you couldn't do before? So it's an interesting question, John. What's your take on the question?
Yeah, I'm tracking with you as well. I think sometimes we hear the term user need and we get very focused on that patient or that clinician as the end user. And of course that is the case, but we should factor in there are other users that are involved in the design and development process. I mean, one could argue FDA is a user in some respects. The UPS guy that's going to transport your product could theoretically be a user too. So be a little bit more holistic. But I tend to agree with you. The design input relates to some source somewhere, and I do think of that it often would originate from some type of user need. Granted, we may not write it down and capture it and document it as such, but it has some sort of origin. So I'm in alignment with you.
And John, I'll take it a step further. Your comments just reminded me of an example that regrettably generated a lot of bad press and a few deaths in our industry a couple of years ago. That stems from the question that I'm sorry, was it Berta asked
Britta.
a moment ago? Bretta, I'm sorry.
Britta.
Okay, and that is the duodenoscope problem, the duodenoscopes that were not reprocessed properly, and as a result led to infections in patients, and in some cases there were some people that died at UCLA and elsewhere. And everybody was asking, why did this problem happen? And do we need new regulation? And I said to the FDA, no, we don't need new regulation. The regulation is already in there. We need people understanding what the intent of the regulation, and this goes to user need. So, one of the concepts in regulatory and quality is, as I said, make sure that your user can use your device. But now the question becomes, who is your user? Most people would define your user as the physician or the patient or whatever. But if your device is designed and labeled to be reprocessed, one of your users is the reprocessor. And so if you don't take into account in the design and testing of your device the ability of the people who are doing the reprocessing to be able to reprocess your device safely and effectively, then in my opinion, you have not met that regulatory requirement. So long story short, and I think, John, you and I did a podcast on this probably a couple of years ago.
We did.
Long story short, we don't need more regulation, in my opinion. We need people understanding the intent of the regulation. So that was a good question.
Yeah, it was a really good question. All right, so Gary makes a statement but I think we could turn it into a question. But I'll read the statement and then we'll go from there. Gary's comment is never let the engineers write the DFU.
I take Gary's not so subtle use of humor. I share probably a similar sense of humor. And I'm curious, John, what do you think is the gist of Gary's comment or question?
Well, I always go back to, well, you and I have talked about this before, that like if I go, I'll use IKEA. Not picking on IKEA, but if I go get a piece of furniture from IKEA and I need to read the assembly instructions, holy cow! It's clear that somebody with a technical background wrote that, and maybe that's what Gary is alluding to. Is sometimes engineer jargon or technical speak may not be well received or well understood or really apply to directions for use for a product. Maybe that's what he's hinting at.
Yeah, I have a feeling you're probably right, and I would take it a step further. As an engineer myself, as somebody that has a PhD in engineering, I often like to say, if I have to read the instructions for any product, then some engineer did not do their job. Yeah. And I just find it fascinating how so many people in the regulatory world and the FDA as well, they seem to live, and I say this with all due respect, in some theoretical bubble where they assume that people read and follow labeling, whether it's high-level labeling or, in Gary's case, the low-level labeling, the directions for use. And I'm sorry, I just don't live in that kind of a world. And I'm more interested in how our medical devices work in the real world, as opposed to in some theoretical bubble. But that's just me. Right.
And totally. And it's we as an industry have historically we've leaned on labeling things like DFUs almost very much as a crutch. It becomes where we capture the CYA. I put a warning in the DFU. Well, folks, if that's where the important information is captured, you might want to rethink your design just a little bit. So we'll let that one be for now. Let's move on to the next question from Gobi. Gobi asks, how about design inputs from risk analysis outputs? I have some interpretation of what Gobi may be hinting at, but what do you think, Mike?
So say that phrase again, the design inputs from
risk analysis outputs.
Design inputs from, okay, so I think what Gobi is saying, and I would love to hear your interpretation as well, John, but I think what he's saying is, all right, as a result of our risk analysis, maybe, for example, in our own internal risk analysis, or maybe through some human factor testing or something, you've identified some risks of the device, and then you take those risks and in turn use those as design inputs to mitigate or perhaps even eliminate those risks in the future. I think that's what he might be saying.
That's my interpretation too, yes.
Yeah, so that's a great example of I think one of the previous questions, and that is does the design input need to result from a user need? In that particular case, we've identified a design input based on risk analysis. So one could argue two ways. Either that one did not come from a user need, or the other way you could argue it is, depending on your definition of user need, your risk mitigation strategy is kind of like a user, right? And the output of that is becoming now going into an input as a design input. So I love that sort of approach. It's an example of looking at this in a holistic fashion. And at the end of the day, it's a great example of trying to design our devices to be as safe and effective as we can make them.
Agreed, 100%. All right, so Eric asks, can user needs be items that are more business related, such as cosmetics or competitive differentiation or cost, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I'll give you my interpretation, and then John, I would love to hear yours. So one of the things that I strongly believe is that all the elements of your quality system should be defined, should be tailored to the company. if you want to sort of redefine what user need to include some of these other, shall we say, non-conventional categories, I have absolutely no problem doing that. You know, on the business side, for example, many people would argue that a user need should be being able to manufacture and sell a device at a price point that is reasonable for the marketplace, you know, that they can get reimbursement for and so on. Because at the end of the day, if you come out with a wonderful device, but it's so expensive that nobody can buy it, how many people are you going to help? So I think, you know, really what it comes down to is your interpretation of user need and how narrow or how broad you want to make it. What are your thoughts, John?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that says a user need has to be only external. I mean, you could have internal user needs that you define that are can definitely have influence over the design and development of your device. So there's nothing wrong with that. You know, when you do that, I know some people when they define and capture things like user needs or even other like design input requirements or other design controls, sometimes they want to cite the source or provide some justification or rationale or some sort of label and that sort of thing. And if that's your preference, then, you know, I would just encourage you to define it. Hey, this is a business need and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, there's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm very, very much encouraged that kind of practice. That way, you know, at the end of the day, you want to try to design and develop something that isn't just amazing, but also it's going to be used. That's why we're doing this.
One thing that I sometimes hear, John, when I give advice about incorporating some of these more non-traditional kind of things into the company's QMS, some companies are a little hesitant to do that because they're fearful that upon inspection, you know, that might cause some you know, ripples or possibly even cause them to get a ding, to get a, you know, a warning letter or 483 or something. Is that been your experience, John?
I've heard people state similar sorts of things as well. That we can't put that in our design history file because then that's something that could be discovered or uncovered during an FDA inspection or audit. Yeah, I've heard that many times.
And listen, call me naive, and certainly many people do, but I encourage companies to do it anyway because I would welcome the opportunity if an inspector came in and say, "Oh, gee, I see, you know, this particular thing in your QMS," and I would say, "Yeah, I'm glad you point that out because that's an illustration of how we're going above and beyond what is simply required to try to take a more comprehensive view and to ultimately, you know, make the product in the best way that we possibly can," which I hope everybody would agree is the intent of all regulation.
And if you're just documenting user needs and design input requirements and other design control activities to simply satisfy a regulatory need, then I'm sorry, you've missed the entire point and purpose of what design controls are there for. Of course, at some point in time, it may be reviewed during an audit or an inspection, and you know, it's proof and objective evidence to demonstrate that you've designed and developed your product in a way that's safe and effective and meets the indications for use. But think of design controls as also a way of you to be able to collaborate and communicate within your company during that process as well. And so the design history file becomes a record that's important about the design and development of that product. It identifies why certain decisions were made. So don't get hung up on that concern about whether or not this can be discovered during an audit or inspection. So, all right. So
I agree with you, John. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I would just add one thing.
No,
I do agree with you, John. But on the other hand, I do have to be a bit pragmatic here because I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. Sometimes, in spite of the best intentions, it can actually cause significant problems. And I'll give you a quick, very real example of how. Not long ago, I was involved with a company who developed, let's just say, a better way to manufacture their particular device. But that better way was not the industry standard. And so on inspection, the inspector came in and said, "Oh, you're not following the industry standard." And the company said, "Yes, you're exactly right. let us explain to you why we're not following it, because we've developed a better way, yada, yada. The inspector said, oh, thank you very much for sharing that with me. That makes sense. Oh, by the way, you're out of spec. Here's your 483 anyway. So we actually penalized a company for doing a better job. And in my opinion, that is not the intent of regulation. That is not the way that this game is supposed to be played. So, so I agree that we can, we should do those kinds of things, but we just have to be careful that, we live in the real world, and that, not everybody looks at it that way.
Yeah, so just being cognizant of time, folks, and appreciate all the questions that you're submitting. There are quite a few, and we'll probably have time for another 2, maybe 3. And so let me identify. Here's a question from Ty. Ty asks, how strong should your justification be when you change your design input or user need?
How strong should your justification be if you change your design input? Well, okay, so that's an interesting question, and I would love to hear your take on it as well, John. I guess, quite frankly, it has to be strong enough to justify making a change in your existing device, or in the design of the device, or in some cases creating a new device. I think the biggest risk there, quite frankly, is business risk, and that is, is it worth taking, spending the time and the money doing it? In terms of the FDA, I don't see that as necessarily as a concern, unless you see it a little differently, John, because they're ultimately concerned with the safety and efficacy of the product, and does it do what's on the label, and so on and so on. So again, maybe I'm not completely understanding the gist of the question, but I don't think that's really so much of a regulatory or a quality issue.
No.
Am I missing something?
Well, I don't think you're missing something, but I do wonder if Ty is maybe hinting at what do you need to do to document like a design change, and Ty, if that's your concern, I think just like with any other change, you need to justify and explain the rationale for why a change is being made, and then also make sure that you've done the proper due diligence and upstream and downstream activities that could be impacted by that. So for example, if you've already gone through and completed verification and validation of your device or what have you, and then you decide or you determine for whatever reason that you need to make a change to a design input requirement, whether add something new or enhance something that was already there, you need to explain and justify or document why you're making that change, and then determine if there's any impact on other activities. Like, do you need to update a certain sort of test or some sort of activity to be able to support that change? So just be thorough and holistic.
And I would offer as a resource, if that's the gist of Ty's question, in terms of change management, last year, as you may remember, John, I did a webinar for Greenlight specifically on change management and how do you decide special 510K versus letter to file versus PMA supplement and so on. So I think that's still available on the Greenlight website. Perhaps Ty might find some of the answers to his question there.
It is. All right. Absolutely. And so, Ty, you can go to greenlight.guru, and on the top of the website, there is a page that says resources, and underneath that, it will take you to webinars and things like that. If you need any help finding that, just shoot us a note, and we'll get you pointed in the right direction. Antoine asked a question. So Antoine's question: do you have an opinion on the traceability of the information in a design control traceability matrix? What's the best method to track and to trace user needs through design verification, design validation activities?
Well, I'll let you answer the part on what's the best method, because I have a feeling, John, I know how you're going to answer that. In terms of the first part of the question, do I have opinion on it? Yes, obviously I have a very strong opinion, and that is it's absolutely necessary. One of the most basic tenets of the good manufacturing practices, and indeed, of regulation across the board, is traceability. Being able to connect the dots from one thing to the next, and so on. So, rather than getting into specific methods or tools on how you can do that, as long as you have good traceability, as long as, kind of like I tell my graduate students when it comes to references, believe it or not, I have people ask me in graduate school what format they should use for their references. Quite frankly, I say to them, I could care less. As long as there's traceability, as long as if I wanted to track down their source, I could do it. What difference does it make to me if they list the author first and then the date, or the date first and then the author? So as long as they have traceability, John, I'll let you talk about what's the best tool to do exactly that.
All right, and Antoine, let me just say it this way: show the flow. You got to show the flow of how things progress through the design and development process, from the user need through the input, through the output, through the verification and validation. And the reason showing that flow in a traceability matrix is so valuable is everything that we do does change. I mean, as much as we resist it, and at times we may say we hate change, change is a constant in life. And so when we design and develop a device and we launch it into the marketplace, it will change. Something about that product will change. And you have to know the connectivity of that information. And this is the single biggest reason why Greenlight.Guru exists, is to provide a tool designed for the medical device professionals such as yourself, so that you can show and demonstrate that flow. You can show how everything is connected together. I would encourage you, if you're not aware of Greenlight Guru, to go to www.greenlight.guru. The tool is built specifically with medical device regulations in mind, and our traceability matrix is winning awards all the time for how simple and easy it is to use and how connected it is to the rest of your entire quality management system architecture.